My mother said I was no longer her son after I left home broke. She changed her mind the day the bank manager knocked. Before I get into mine, the last story you heard was about a Will Reed 6 months too late. This one's about a mother who said something almost as final, and it took a knock on her front door, not a lawyer's office, to make her take it back. My mother told me I wasn't her son anymore on a Tuesday afternoon, standing on the front step of the room I was renting, with a garbage bag full of things I'd left at her house sitting in her car behind her like she'd planned the moment down to the prop. I should say up front, before you decide who to root for here, because I think it genuinely matters to how you hear the rest of this. I wasn't a good son in the years leading up to that moment. I'm not telling you this story to make myself the hero of it. I was 24, unemployed for the third time in 2 years, and I'd borrowed money from my mother more times than either of us could count without it turning into a fight. Some of that was bad luck. A lot of it was me not handling the bad luck like an adult. I want that on the record before anything else. My name's Mike. My mother, Carol, raised my sister Ashley and me on her own from the time I was 9, after my dad left and mostly disappeared from the picture. She worked as a dental hygienist for almost 30 years, put both of us through community college on a salary that never should have stretched that far, and she did it, from what I could tell growing up, mostly out of sheer stubbornness. She's not a soft woman. She loves hard, but she loves the way some people discipline, with conditions attached, with expectations you're supposed to already know without being told. I used to think that was just her personality. I've come to understand it a little differently since all this happened, but I'll get there. The last straw from her side of it was a loan I never paid back. $4,000, supposedly to cover a security deposit and first month's rent on an apartment after I lost a warehouse job and got behind on everything. I told her it was temporary. I believed it was temporary. It wasn't. I got another job 3 months later, a decent one actually, at a distribution center with real hours and real pay. But by then I'd already fallen behind on the loan payments I'd promised her, and pride did the rest. I kept telling myself I'd catch up next month, and next month kept sliding further away, the way debt to family does when you'd rather avoid the conversation than have it. She didn't come to my apartment right away. What actually happened first is that I stopped answering her calls for about 3 weeks, which in hindsight was maybe the worst possible move I could have made. Because to my mother, silence has always read as guilt confirmed rather than a kid too ashamed to pick up the phone. She showed up at the house I was renting a room in on a Tuesday afternoon. No warning, driving the same 15-year-old Camry she'd had since I was in high school. I remember opening the door and seeing her face, not angry exactly, or not only angry, more like someone who'd already grieved something and was just there to confirm the funeral had happened, and knowing immediately this wasn't going to be a conversation. It was going to be a verdict, and I was going to be standing there while she delivered it. She had a garbage bag with her, sitting on the passenger seat of the Camry, which I only understood later was full of things I'd left at her house over the years. A jacket, some old photos, a box of trophies from a baseball league I'd quit at 13. She never even brought it up to the door that day. She just stood on the step and told me she was done. She told me in a voice that didn't rise once the entire time that she'd spent her whole life bailing people out, my father, back before he left. Then me, over and over. And at various points even Ashley, though Ashley's messes were smaller and better hidden than mine ever were. She said she wasn't doing it anymore, that she couldn't, that every dollar she handed me felt less like help and more like watching herself get smaller. And she said the thing I've heard in my head more times than I can count since, the thing that still shows up unannounced at 2 in the morning, sometimes even now. I raised a son, Mike. I don't know who you turned into, but he's not the son I raised, and I'm done pretending otherwise. I didn't say anything back. I don't even remember if I tried. I remember the screen door between us and the smell of cut grass from somewhere down the street, completely ordinary, completely wrong for the moment. He got back in the Camry and drove away, and it was only weeks later that Ashley told me about the garbage bag still sitting in Mom's garage, like she hadn't been able to decide whether getting rid of it was final in a way she wasn't ready for. That was 2 years before the part of this story that actually matters, and I want to be honest that the 2 years in between were rough on both of us in ways that had nothing to do with money. We didn't talk. Not once, not even a text on a birthday, which for a family that used to at least fake pleasantries on holidays felt like its own kind of loud silence. Ashley tried to play go-between for a while, forwarding me updates I didn't ask for and relaying half-hearted questions from Mom I never quite believed were really questions, and eventually she gave up entirely, telling me both of us were too stubborn to be worth the headache, which fair enough. I got my life together, slowly, in the unglamorous way people actually get their lives together. No dramatic turning point, no single morning where I woke up a different person. Just showing up to the distribution center job every day, even on the mornings I didn't want to. Then a promotion into a supervisor role about 8 months in. Then finally saving enough after a year to move out of a room I was renting from a guy I barely knew into a real one-bedroom apartment with my name on the lease. I remember signing that lease and thinking, almost involuntarily, that I wished I could tell my mother, and then remembering I couldn't, and letting that thought sit there uncomfortably for the rest of the day. I paid off the loan to her in full about a year and a half after she'd told me I wasn't her son anymore. I mailed the check with no note because I didn't know what a note was even supposed to say at that point. Sorry felt too small, and anything bigger felt like I was performing for her rather than just doing the right thing because it was the right thing. She cashed it. I know because I checked my account and watched the withdrawal clear. She never called to say thank you, and she never called at all after that, not for my birthday, not for Christmas, and I told myself that was fine, that was fair, that I'd earned the silence with every missed payment before it. I mostly believed that. Some nights I believed it more than others. What I didn't know, because nobody was telling me anything about her life by that point any more than she was asking about mine, was that my mother had started making some very different financial decisions in the 2 years after that loan blew up between us. She'd started dating a man named Gary about a year after the split with me, a smooth-talking guy, according to Ashley, who worked in investments, which is one of those phrases that should set off alarm bells and rarely does for the person hearing it about their own parent. Gary convinced her to refinance the house, the same house I grew up in, paid off years earlier, the one piece of real security she had left after 30 years of hard work, to free up capital for what he described as a guaranteed real estate investment opportunity down in Florida. She didn't tell Ashley the details. She barely told Ashley it was happening at all. By the time Ashley found out, the refinance was already done, and a good chunk of the proceeds had already gone to Gary's opportunity. I only learned any of this because Ashley finally called me, almost exactly 2 years after Mom's front step garbage bag, in a state I'd never heard her in before, not crying exactly, more like flattened, like someone who'd been holding something too heavy for too long and had finally run out of arms. It was almost 11 at night when she called, which was already unusual for Ashley, who's never been a night caller in her life. I picked up expecting bad news about Mom's health, honestly, and in a way I wasn't entirely wrong. She told me Mom had missed 2 mortgage payments on the refinanced loan, which Ashley had only found out about because she'd stopped by unannounced on a Sunday to drop off some groceries, and seen a certified mail envelope from the bank sitting unopened on the kitchen counter, propped against the napkin holder like Mom had looked at it once, and then simply decided not to look at it again. Ashley said she'd asked about it directly, and Mom had brushed her off with something about paperwork mix-ups, which Ashley didn't believe for a second because our mother has never once in her life been vague about paperwork. Vague isn't in her, so Ashley pushed. She told me it took almost 2 hours of sitting at that kitchen table, refusing to leave, before Mom finally told her about Gary, a man Ashley had met maybe 3 times at family things, always smiling too widely, always talking about deals he had going in Tampa and Sarasota that never seemed to have a name you could actually look up. Ashley told me about the refinance, about how Mom hadn't told either of us because she said she didn't want to be lectured by her own kids, about the investment that turned out, when Ashley tried to research it herself at that kitchen table on her phone, to have no paperwork behind it beyond a glossy 1-page brochure and Gary's word. She told me Mom wouldn't talk about any of it further, wouldn't ask for help, was doing the exact same thing she'd once accused me of doing, letting pride run the whole operation straight into a wall rather than have one uncomfortable conversation before it was too late. It's like watching her turn into you, Ashley said, and then immediately apologized for saying it, though we both knew it was true, and neither of us found it easy to laugh about. I sat with that for a couple of days before I did anything, mostly because I genuinely didn't know if it was my place anymore. She'd told me I wasn't her son. I'd spent 2 years building a life that didn't depend on her opinion of me ever changing, and some quiet, stubborn part of me had gotten used to the shape of that life, the way you get used to a limp after a while and start walking around it instead of trying to fix it. Some petty, still wounded part of me, and I'll own that part because it was real, and I don't think there's much use pretending it wasn't, wanted to let her find out the hard way what it felt like to actually lose something you couldn't get back, the way she'd once made it sound like I already had when I was 24 and drowning. I even said as much to my girlfriend at the time, lying on the couch one night with my phone open to Deborah's number, not calling it, just looking at it. I told her some part of me wanted to let it happen, let the house go, let Mom feel exactly what powerless felt like for once instead of always being the one handing it out. She didn't tell me I was wrong to feel that. She just asked me if I actually wanted to become someone who let that happen when I had the ability to stop it. I didn't have a good answer for her that night. I'm not sure I have a perfect one now. But I called Deborah's branch 2 days later anyway. What moved me off, it wasn't some noble realization. It was picturing her alone in that kitchen with an unopened envelope from the bank, at 61 years old, having spent her whole adult life making sure her kids never had to feel what she was apparently now feeling by herself. Whatever she'd said to me on that porch, I didn't actually want that for her. I started by asking Ashley for whatever paperwork she could get her hands on, which wasn't much. Mom guarded it closely, out of embarrassment more than anything, Ashley suspected. But Ashley did get a look at the certified letter before Mom finally opened it, and it was from the bank that held the refinanced mortgage, warning about the missed payments and referencing a formal notice of default that would follow if the account wasn't brought current. I looked up the bank branch, a regional one, not a huge national chain, and found the name of the branch manager listed in an old local news article about a community fundraiser, a woman named Deborah Whitfield. I called the branch directly, explained who I was, and asked, honestly not expecting much, whether there was anything that could be done for a homeowner facing default before things escalated to foreclosure proceedings. Deborah was more willing to talk than I expected, though she was careful, obviously, about what she could actually disclose to a son who wasn't on the account. What she could tell me, in general terms, was that the bank had programs for hardship cases, forbearance plans, loan modifications, sometimes even mediation programs through the state, but that all of them required the actual account holder to initiate the process, and that from what she could see in the notes on the file, the bank had already tried reaching my mother multiple times without any response. I asked Deborah if there was any way she'd be willing to reach out in person instead of by mail, since it seemed like mail wasn't getting through to my mother in any way that mattered. I don't know exactly why I asked that, except that I remembered how differently the world had felt to me back when someone showed up in person instead of just calling. How much harder it is to keep avoiding something once it's standing on your porch instead of sitting in an envelope. Deborah told me that wasn't standard practice, but that given the file was heading toward a default notice regardless, a courtesy visit wasn't out of the question if I thought it would actually help rather than make things worse. I told her I honestly didn't know, but that ignoring it clearly wasn't working. I want to be clear, I didn't orchestrate some grand confrontation here. I wasn't trying to force my way back into her life through a bank employee. I mostly just wanted someone with actual authority and actual solutions to get in front of my mother before the situation became unrecoverable, because I knew, better than almost anyone, exactly how good she was at letting pride outrun her own best interests. It takes one to know one, as they say. Deborah went out to the house herself on a Thursday afternoon, about 10 days after I'd called her. Ashley happened to be there when it happened. She'd started dropping by more since finding that first envelope, worried in a way that had turned into something like a quiet vigil. And she told me the whole thing afterward in pieces over a few different phone calls, because I think it took her a while to process it too. According to Ashley, Mom answered the door expecting it to be Gary, who by that point had stopped returning her calls entirely. His phone apparently disconnected the week before, and instead found a woman in a navy blazer holding a manila folder, introducing herself calmly as being from the bank. Ashley said Mom's face went through about 4 different expressions in the space of 10 seconds. Confusion first, then something like fear, the specific fear of a person who's been avoiding a piece of mail for weeks and now has to look it in the eye, and finally a kind of exhausted resignation that Ashley said was almost worse to watch than anger would have been, because at least anger still has some fight left in it. Deborah, to her enormous credit, didn't lead with the numbers or the default notice sitting in that folder. She asked, gently, standing right there on the porch, if they could sit down inside and talk through some options together before anything got worse. Ashley said Mom hesitated for a second, that old pride again, the same pride that had kept the envelope unopened on the counter for 2 weeks, and then stepped back from the door to let her in. They sat at that same kitchen table where Ashley had had her own 2-hour conversation weeks earlier, and Deborah walked through, patiently, what a loan modification could look like, what documentation the bank would need, how much time they realistically had before things escalated toward a formal default filing. It was only partway into that conversation, when Mom finally asked, almost as an aside, how the bank had even known to send someone out in person instead of another letter she could ignore, that Deborah paused for a moment, glanced toward Ashley almost like she was asking silent permission, and answered carefully. Mom asked which family member. Ashley said. Deborah hesitated, glanced at Ashley for permission she didn't actually need, and said, "Your son Mike called us." Ashley told me Mom didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she asked Deborah to give her and Ashley a minute alone in the kitchen, and when they came back, according to Ashley, Mom's voice was different, smaller, she said, in a way she'd never heard from our mother in her entire life. The bank ended up working out a loan modification that got Mom current on the mortgage over 18 months instead of demanding an immediate lump sum, which Deborah told me later was very much not guaranteed and had required some genuine advocacy on the file, both from Deborah, and once she got involved, from a housing counselor the bank connected Mom with. Gary, as far as anyone can tell, took a significant chunk of the refinance proceeds and simply vanished from her life the moment the money dried up, which surprised exactly no one but Mom. Mom called me herself, 4 days after Deborah's visit. I saw her name on my phone screen and just stared at it for 2 full rings before I answered, my heart doing something I hadn't felt it do in years, not since I was a kid waiting to find out how much trouble I was actually in. It was the first time we'd spoken since the check I mailed with no note, almost a year and a half of silence sitting between us like a room neither of us had been willing to walk back into. She didn't apologize outright, that's not really her way, and I don't think I expected it to be, not from her, not in one phone call. But she asked how I'd known about the mortgage, her voice careful, almost formal, like she was interviewing a stranger instead of talking to her son. When I explained Ashley's call, Deborah's number, the whole small chain of it, she went quiet on the other end for long enough that I checked to see if the call had dropped. It hadn't. She was just taking it in. The way I was starting to recognize was her version of processing something too big to respond to right away. She said, eventually, in a voice smaller than I'd ever heard from her, "I told you that you weren't my son anymore." That was a cruel thing to say to a kid who was struggling, and I knew it was cruel when I said it. And I said it anyway because I needed somewhere to put how scared I was that I couldn't fix you. I don't know why it took someone else's kindness to make me see that. I didn't say anything for a second either. Then I told her it wasn't someone else's kindness. It was hers, originally. I'd just been paying it forward to someone who needed a chance to be scared out loud instead of alone. We're not fully repaired. My mother and I, 2 years of silence doesn't undo itself in a single phone call, however honest that call was, and there are still moments, a wrong word, a long pause where I can feel both of us bracing for the other one to bring up the porch, the garbage bag, the check with no note. But we talk now most weeks, sometimes just about nothing, which after 2 years of nothing at all feels like its own small miracle. She's met my girlfriend, sat across from her at a diner, and asked her real questions instead of polite ones. Last month she asked my opinion on something for the first time in longer than I can remember. Nothing important in the grand scheme of things. Just whether she should replant the flower beds out front now that spring was coming. But it mattered to me more than she probably realizes, because it meant she'd started thinking of me again as someone whose opinion was worth having, instead of someone she'd already finished grieving. I think about that front step a lot still, the garbage bag sitting in the back seat of her Camry, the sentence she used like a door slamming shut in real time. I think about how close I came to letting my own hurt keep that door shut permanently, how easy it would have been, how almost justified it would have felt, to let the silence win simply because I'd been the one hurt first. It looked like justice at the time, at least from where I was standing on that step. In hindsight, it looks a lot more like fear wearing justice's clothes, dressed up just enough to let me feel righteous about staying angry instead of picking up a phone. Speaking of doors slamming shut in front of other people, publicly, in front of an audience that made the whole thing sting worse. The next one's about a brother who fired me from our father's own company in front of the entire staff, fully convinced he had the authority to do it. He found out otherwise faster than either of us expected, and in front of just as many people as he'd humiliated me in front of.